que são ativamente invisibilizadas mostram seu valor, como exatamente de dar respostas rápidas de abastecimento alimentar, de alimentos de qualidade, pero a partir de outras perspectivas. Então, não cambiamos o tema, simplesmente mostrar que como que o Covid é uma tragédia que, ao mesmo tempo, mostra um lado, que é o lado mais visível, pero temos que mostrar o lado invisibilizado, que é exatamente outras economias e uma economia basada em outros valores. É exatamente isto, uma economia de cuidado, uma economia de reprodução, uma economia basada em outros valores que não é solamente os mercados. Então, como disse o Papa Francisco com sua economia de Francisco, não é uma economia da exclusão e da desigualdade, onde o dinheiro reina e não serve a gente. É uma economia que mata. Estas são palavras de Francisco, com sua economia de Francisco, e agora acaba de reiterar com sua nova encíclica sobre o lado obscuro que há que cambiar com outra sociabilidade, uma outra economia. Então, não falamos que os alimentos são mercancias como outra qualquer. É necessário ter outros valores de regulamento. E aí, a agroecologia aporta muitíssimo com uma perspectiva de echar luz sobre outras economias e echar luz sobre outros sujeitos sociais, sobre sujeitos sociais que estão historicamente invisibilizados e echar luz ao hecho de que as mulheres são as grandes protagonistas da agroecologia e também da construção desta economia. Sempre foram, siguen sendo, e a pandemia explicita isto outra vez. Lutar contra a ortodoxia econômica. Então, hablamos em nosso editorial que é necessário outro pacto social, uma economia basada em bem comum, não? Pero que este pacto social só é necessário se for superado o patriarcado. Este pacto social só é necessário se for superar o racismo. Só é possível se for também pacto com os outros organismos da natureza. Também é pacto natural, não? Então, estas são as ideias centrais desta edição. Devemos agradecer desde o início que este arreglo entre SIDS e Agriculture Network teve uma colaboração muito importante da ex-diretora da ILEA, Edith Van Walson, a quem agradecemos, também a Sarah Schneider, de Miserior, que estuve desde o início nessa construção. E eu, como brasileiro, não poderia deixar de dizer que é necessário celebrar, para nós é muito importante uma mulher, uma brasileira, que acaba de falecer há poucos meses, com 99 anos, e esta semana passada haria 100 anos, Ana Maria Primavesi, que é uma das mulheres que echou luz no movimento agroecológico brasileiro e latino-americano, e por isso, em Brasil, comemoramos o Dia Nacional de Agroecologia, que foi há 4 dias, com o dia de nascimento de Ana Maria Primavesi. Como tantas outras mulheres, foi muito agredida por suas ideias e por suas práticas, pero seguiu adelante e estamos hoje comemorando toda a sua sabedoria e nós em Brasil e Latinoamérica devemos muito às suas ensinanças. Graças, Janneke.
Thank you very much, Paulo, for these words. So it's very important to note that the magazine tells many experiences from around the world, which show that the feminist values of agroecology are not just about recognizing the knowledge and the work of women. It's also about new values for our society and our economy, values of life, relationships, trust, care, and balance. And so we have many stories from around the world where people have integrated these values into their work on agroecology. At the end of this webinar, we'll give you the link so you can access all of these articles. I'd now like to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Leonida Odongo. The magazine features an interview with Leonida. She is an activist and educator. She works on agroecology, feminism, human rights, and social justice, and she's based in Kenya. Leonida plays an active role in the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, AFSA, in the World March of Women, and also in the civil society mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security. Leonida currently coordinates the activities of a coalition called Haki Nawiri Africa, which is an initiative that advances social justice among university students, smallholder farmers, and communities who are all impacted by climate change. So Leonida, the floor is yours. I understand you have a PowerPoint presentation, but we would also like to see if you can switch on your video for a while so that we can see your face.
Hello.
The floor is yours, Leonida.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to say that it's a pleasure being in this space, and I want to share what's happened, the Kenyan situation when you talk about agroecology and when you talk about issues around agroecology. One thing I'd like to say is that when COVID happened, Africa was already in other crises. For example, the crisis of food insecurity, the crisis of climate change. We had another crisis of fall armyworms, and of course there was the crisis of desert locusts. And COVID made the situation become even more dire in terms of food production. Some of the systemic challenges that exist for African farmers, for instance, include one is the fact that agribusiness companies have realized that food is a multi-million dollar business. And what they are doing is that they are reaching every nook and corner of Africa. For example, if you go even to the most remote village in Africa today, you're going to find an agrovet shop. It has seeds and it has chemicals, and they target farmers because they know that there are millions of farmers in Africa, so this is a ready market. Another thing is that when these chemical companies come to Africa, they convince the farmers that when you use chemicals, you're going to get better yields. But in reality, you only get better yields just for a short time. But then afterwards, what happens is that your soil loses its fertility. You end up becoming enslaved because you have to go to the agrovet every season. And of course, sometimes when you can go buy the seeds and they end up not growing. And sadly, this is a loss to the farmers because, for example, they use manual labor. They don't have machinery to till the land. These are farmers to whom farming is a daily occurrence, is a day in economic activity. And so when these crops don't grow, it means that they are going through double losses. And another thing is that if you look at, for instance, issues around pesticides, you find that in Europe, many pesticides have been outlawed, but sadly they're finding their way into Africa. And this is because of weak legislations that we have in the African continent that do not properly regulate the pesticides. And of course, if you look at the relationship between pesticides and health, you find that there are rising cases of cancer. Like in Kenya, for example, now you find that almost every family has a member or has a relative who has cancer. And you find that this is related to the pesticides and the type of food that people eat. And another thing I want to point out is that there's corporate capture of agriculture. And this is exemplified by issues like, for example, genetic modification. There are punitive clauses within legislations. There's also an imbalanced international political economy. And what I mean is that African farmers, for example, are relegated to the position of primary producers. They produce primary products which end up being sold in markets abroad. And whatever the primary producers get is actually not comparable with what the final product is, the price of the final product. If, for example, I give an example of Ghana as a country that produces cocoa. If you look at the lives of farmers in Ghana, and they're the ones who are producing cocoa, but they cannot be able to afford chocolate, and they can not even afford to go to Java and buy coffee. And it's so rhetoric because they are the ones who are producing this product. And of course, the other problem is agriculture-related loans. And with agricultural loans, what's happening in many African countries is that corporations are coming and they tell farmers that we are going to give you loans, and you're also going to give you, with that loan, you're going to give you seeds and pesticides. So it means that farmers are chained to these companies because they have to go and borrow. They are going to be getting sources, the seeds and pesticides from these companies, and some even end up not being able to pay what they borrow from the companies. And there've been incidences where land has been lost because you are unable to pay off your debts. And another thing is that, for example, and this is related to the importance of agroecology, is that with COVID-19, what happened is that one thing we need to know is that the emergence of COVID-19 is a reflection of climate crisis and loss of biodiversity, because pathogens can no longer, pathogens, the hosts, pathogens have to take up new hosts because of loss of diversity, and this new host becomes mankind. And so with that, it's a reminder that when we bring back our diversity, when we were able to bring make our soil become more productive, when we adopt natural processes of food production, we are actually able to bring back the diversity, and also at the same time we are able to address pathogens. And one thing also that was coming in the midst of COVID-19 is the fact that it has really reminded us that food, we can do without, for example, crossing borders. We can do without going to school, but we cannot do without food. So it's a reminder that food is very important, and we need to look at what type of food we are eating. It has to be food that is healthy. It has to be food that is safe. It has to be food that is free from chemicals and any other pathogens. And if we look at, for instance, what role do women play in terms of food production, and link that to feminism? One thing is that if you look at within the African context, women are the majority of food producers. If you look at the agricultural sector, women are the majority of workers in the agricultural sector. In Kenya, for example, 70 to 80% of food producers are women, and majority of these women are found in the rural areas. But sadly, if you look at, for example, in the homestead, you find that there's gendered division of labor. You find women do more work compared to men, and you also find that when resources are in the household, you find that women only control resources that don't have a lot of money attached to them. You find that it's men who control productive resources such as land and cattle, but women are controlling food. Women control food, for example, that are not, even if they are cash crops, they don't earn a lot of money. And we've had incidences, for instance, where a woman will till the land, but when it comes to, she'll go and sell the farm produce, but when she comes home, she has to give the money to the man to decide on how the money is going to be used. And another thing, fortunately, is that women are not giving up. They're coming together in groups, and we call them, locally, we call them chamas. And within these chamas, they're also involved in things like table banking, but at the same time, they're also engaged in issues around food production and selling their food. And when you look at patriarchy and food security, one thing is that land is the primary resource when we talk about food production. And another thing is that if you are able to control the resources, you are able to, you have a lot of power. You find that for example, where in instances where there's contractual farming, it's the males who control, for example, who make a decision, who sign the contracts. You can find in some instances, women do not even have an identity card, and for you to participate in any transaction, for example, in a country like Kenya, you need an identity card. And if you look at, for example, in instances where there is a compensation in terms of, let's say, there's been a mega development in a community and there's compensation, you find that it's men who get the compensation money, and once they get it, they disappear, and the women continue to suffer. And that's why now there's the push for joint titling, so that the men do not make decisions alone without excluding women from decision making. Maybe I can just share some of the approaches that we've been using at the community level in terms of strengthening agroecology and also building people's consciousness. One of them is something called tafakari forums. Tafakari is a Swahili word meaning to reflect. So basically we go to the community and in one of the farmers' homesteads, and we do political and technical education of the entire food production process. And one thing we realize is that farmers are using chemicals, but when you go to the farming community, you don't demonize what they're doing. So we let them know that the dangers of use of chemicals. And this we have in sessions, for example, called Care for Crops, where we also share with farmers, for instance, what is the share capital of Monsanto? What is the share capital, for instance, of Bayer and all these companies, and how many farmers are there in the world? So the farmers are able to reflect and ask themselves, why should I continue going to the agrovet to continue increasing the market share of these multinational corporations? And then another thing is that, for example, when we have Tafakari forums discussing soil fertility, because we know if your soil is not fertile, it means that even the food that you're going to get out of that soil is not going to be healthy. So what happens during the Tafakari forums, and when you're talking about soil fertility, we have farmers sharing their experiences. How long have they been doing farming? What has been their experience, for example, when they are doing farming? Farmers will tell you that in the past, they never used to use any chemicals, but now they are forced to use chemicals at every level of food production. From the soil, when they are tilling the land, they have to use chemicals. When they are planting, they have to use chemicals. Even at harvesting, they have to put chemicals to prevent rot. And that's why now we train them on agroecology as being an alternative, and not just any alternative, but a workable alternative. And when we train them, for example, on how to bring back fertility to the soil, we also train them on how to do soil composting. The practical steps on how to do soil composting. We also train them on kitchen gardens. And also we talk to them about nutrition and the importance of having a balanced diet, because you find that farmers will always sell the best food in the market and leave their children without good nutrition. And that's why now the element of a balanced diet becomes very, very important. You can find
Leonida, you have 2 more minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. And another approach is peer learning between the farmers, where they learn from each other. Farmers from one part of the country go to another locality with a slightly different agroecological zone and learn from each other. And at the same time, we also encourage farmers to set up seed banks at the community level, so that we've realized that indigenous seeds thrive better compared to what they buy from the agrovet. So when we enhance seed sovereignty at the grassroots level, farmers are able to control what they produce. And this is very, very important when you're talking about food sovereignty, when you're talking about agroecology, and when you're talking about power to the farmers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leonida. And I'm sorry that we couldn't listen to you for much longer, but we have more speakers to listen to. But it's very important to hear about the impact of pesticides that you have witnessed, and how you work with women's groups and other farmers to make change in your territories. We'd now like to move on to another speaker, who is Rachel Bezner Kerr. She is a professor at Cornell University in the US in the Department of Global Development. And Rachel is also a co-author of the report from 2019 by the high-level panel of experts. And she was one of the experts who wrote the report on agroecological and other innovative approaches for sustainable agriculture and food systems. Rachel wrote a column in the magazine entitled, and she makes the case for a feminist reparative agroecology. Rachel, can I give you the floor to tell us what that means?
Thank you so much, and I'm really honored to be amongst this very illustrious panel, and I'm honored to speak right after Leonida. It's been really a pleasure to see everyone and to hear her thoughts. So I want to focus on this notion of feminist agroecology as not being just about gender equality. Certainly the focus of the work that I've been involved with long-term in Malawi and also in Tanzania has been working on trying to address inequities between men and women, including division of labor, control over decision-making, domestic violence. And that's really essential if you want to have a food system that works for everyone and doesn't just produce more food or produce food in an environmentally friendly way. But it's not just about increasing access to resources and in addressing inequalities between men and women, but it's really a new way of having relationships, not only between men and women, but between people and nature and people and the land. And it's about, in essence, and this is really one of the key messages that we drew from the HLPE report, was that it's about power, addressing power relationships, addressing power inequities between men and women, but there are many other power inequities that are part of what makes this food system that we currently have so broken. And we heard some of what the ways in which that plays out in Kenya from Leonida, but we see that in all over the world, different ways that there are inequities that need to be addressed. And so that means valuing the kinds of work that women do to try to create healthy food and try to share their knowledge and look after kids and look after older people. And often that care work is undervalued and unappreciated. And I really liked how Paolo drew links with the current COVID-19 crisis for drawing this into the public realm much more visibly, this care work that goes on. And of course, it's not just women who do that care work. And part of what a feminist agroecology is trying to bring men more into the conversation, bring men more into doing this care work, and ensuring that they have relationships with their kids, that they're involved in producing food and preparing food. And this can have benefits for men as well as women. And it's not just in the home, but more broadly. So feminist agroecology is really thinking about the different levels of inequities at different places. So you have inequities in households, but you also have inequities in community, and you have inequities in society more broadly, and then across nations. And so it's very aspirational in a way, but it starts in the place where people are growing and preparing and sharing food. And some of the ways that feminist agroecology is different from only looking at gender equality is by looking at different types of inequities and the ways in which they overlap. So thinking about racial inequality, thinking about class inequalities, and how those inequalities, which often overlap, are some of the reasons why some people have less access to healthy food and are less able to consume food that doesn't have pesticide exposure, or they themselves are exposed to pesticide exposure because they're working under very difficult conditions as farm workers, for example. This term maybe makes it more complicated than it is, but intersectionality was a term coined by a Black feminist scholar, Kim Crenshaw, which really is about this overlap between gender, race, caste, which varies by place and varies by by time. And it's really something that's become in the public realm in the last year in the United States and all around the world, thinking about structural racism and the ways in which that shapes people's access to food and access to safety in their homes and communities. So that's part of being a feminist agroecologist, is really thinking about those relationships and not only about how we can grow food in ways that ensures, you know, a healthy ecosystem and safe water. But it maybe sounds too intellectual. And I think from our work in Malawi, it began with trying to find alternatives to synthetic fertilizer because people couldn't afford synthetic fertilizer and they wanted alternatives. So they began experimenting with different alternatives, some of what Leonida was talking about, the farmer to farmer exchange, and really making sure that women were involved in those dialogues because women are very active in farming in Malawi. But then going beyond that, how to translate in more diverse foods that are being produced by farmers, you know, growing legumes to improve soil fertility. You have more food at your disposal. How to ensure that that translates into improved child nutrition, which is a big issue in Malawi. And some of that means addressing this inequity in homes around food preparation and childcare. And so the idea that farmers came up with, which sounded really simple when we started, was having recipe days where people brought together different foods they prepared using agroecological methods, and then preparing those foods together, but men being involved in that food preparation. So these simple kind of fun, festive activities were a kind of way of having a performance that involved men, and maybe initially very reluctantly, in pounding things to make flour and stirring the pot. But it over time became a very joyful way for men to think differently and women to think differently about the roles that they have in their communities. That's an example from our work in Malawi that we found to be quite powerful, although slow. And it's not just a matter of having recipe days, but also having discussions, dialogue, and difficult discussions about different ways of being in relationship with one another. But we found that to be quite transformative. And in one study we did in Malawi with 400 households who were highly food insecure and who did experiments with different agroecological methods over 3 years. And we had these various ways of bringing up issues around gender inequity in communities. We had recipe days, we had dramas, we had small group discussions. Those households that began to talk to their spouses about farming were 2.4 times more likely to improve their food security and nutrition. So that's very powerful in a short period of time. This provided evidence of how a sort of feminist agroecology that really draws our attention to these social inequities is a crucial way that we can start to have more healthy and reparative communities. So I feel like I've talked enough. I feel like you're going to tell me you have 1 minute, so maybe I can stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel, and especially for bringing really to the fore and emphasizing the issues of power and equity and the intersectionality that comes at play. So thank you very much. No, you were right on time. We're a little late, but that's fine. You didn't go over your time. I'd now like to, first of all, anyone who has a question for either Leonida or Rachel, please put it in the Q&A box, which you see at the bottom of your screen. If you cannot work with that, you can also put your question in the chat. And for those who have come in late, you can select your language on the button interpretation at the bottom of your screen, if you prefer to listen in Spanish or in French. Then I'd like to invite Sophia, who has been making illustrations, to share her screen and show us what she has been drawing so far, if that's possible. Sophia is our illustrator today, and while our speakers have been talking, she has been making...
Hello, I'm on it. Just give me a second. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. Okay. Do you want to talk us through it a little bit?
Oh,
Maybe 1 minute?
This is just the first half. I didn't identify the speakers because I was less focused on who is talking and more I wanted to catch the narrative of what everybody was saying. But just to go over the introduction, you can see more on the left side, and then there is a piece on the right side on the top about the Kenya. And about Kenya, and then the last speakers, the relationships and the inequalities between men and women, that is on the bottom right part. And I would like to keep on adding illustrations so that the whole thing becomes evocative of what we are hearing. So I'll be back at the end. Hopefully it's going to be an even richer picture by then.
Thank you so much. I already recognize many things that have been said, and it's really nice to see them visually laid out like that. Thank you, Sophia. We're now going to switch gears a little bit. We have two fantastic women with us who have also written for the magazine. One is from Brazil, Iridiani Graciela Seibert, and the other one is Isabel Alvarez Vispo, who we will call Isa. And she's from Basque Country in Spain. We will have questions for them. I will have questions for them, and your questions you can put in the chat. So I start with Iridiani, who is an agroecologist at the University of Agroecology Paulo Freire, and also an activist of the movement of peasant women. So Iridiani, are you there?
Sí, sí estoy. Bueno, buenos días. Saludar a todos los presentes, aquí panelistas y también todos los y las que nos acompañan aquí en ese webinario. Y es un honor estar aquí y poder hablar de este tema, que es un tema tan importante, que es la agroecología y el feminismo, y poder también estar en ese espacio para poder presentar también nuestra experiencia, nuestro acúmulo en la unidad de estos dos temas que para nosotras son fundamentales. Y también saludar especialmente a Isabel, que nosotras también compartimos espacios de lucha con esa temática de la agroecología y del feminismo en el mecanismo de la sociedad civil y los pueblos indígenas. Y para Isabel, entonces, me gustaría poder hacerle una pregunta para que pueda hablar también de su trabajo y sus acúmulos, que es en el sentido de que, de acuerdo con su experiencia en los espacios internacionales y también en su territorio, ¿usted considera cuáles son los desafíos y cuáles son las oportunidades para que la agroecología y el feminismo alcancen escala también en el sentido de políticas públicas?
Bueno, buenas tardes. ¿Se me escucha bien? Sí, ¿no? Espero que sí.
Sí, sí, sí.
Gracias. Bueno, un placer, la verdad, y un gusto, bueno, saludaros a todas, y también especial a Iridiani, que, bueno, nos encontramos en muchos sitios físicamente y hoy, bueno, pues nos encontramos por acá. Bueno, se han dicho muchas cosas, además ya de las dos, del feminismo y la agroecología, ¿no? Y bueno, en la pregunta que haces de los desafíos y oportunidades, bueno, voy a empezar por las oportunidades, bueno, voy a ir intercalando oportunidades y desafíos para que no sea, muy, muy negativa la cosa. Bueno, yo creo que como oportunidades, por desgracia, yo creo que una oportunidad viene a partir del caos climático que tenemos, que hace que el propio planeta hable, ¿no? Y ya está poniendo en evidencia a qué nivel de desastre estamos llegando, y esto, bueno, da una oportunidad a veces para que haya más espacios de los que hablar de esto, ¿no? Fuera de las ya convencidas y de las que ya más o menos manejamos ciertas cuestiones. Y yo creo que el planeta habla y, bueno, y a la vez las feministas gritamos, ¿no? Y creo que esto también es una oportunidad, ¿no? Porque cada vez estamos más organizadas, cada vez gritamos más y hacemos que se nos escuche más. Y eso está haciendo también que se vayan generando cada vez más espacios con miradas ecofeministas, ¿no? Donde se van cruzando perspectivas. De momento, por lo menos yo hablo desde una perspectiva europea y demás, yo lo que veo aquí es que empieza a hablarse cada vez más de ecofeminismo, aunque menos desde una perspectiva rural y más desde una perspectiva urbana. A la vez empieza a hablarse cada vez más de un feminismo campesino, y entonces creo que el desafío ahí es que se encuentren, ¿no? O sea, que la perspectiva ecofeminista más urbana, que empieza a ver ya muchas cosas, se encuentre con ese feminismo campesino, ¿no? Para construir juntas, ¿no? Y al final eso pues hará una construcción agroecológica, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido creo que los propios desastres y demás son una oportunidad. El desafío mayor que creo que tenemos todas las que estamos aquí, unas más que otras, es el alto coste que tiene gritar hoy en día, ¿no? Sobre todo para las mujeres. O sea, para muchas el coste es su propia vida, cuando protestáis o protestamos por estas cosas, y de ahí para abajo, ¿no? Pero son múltiples las violencias que se reciben por gritar y por cuestionar el modelo que cuestionamos todos los días y las desigualdades, y creo que eso es un gran desafío, ¿no? Y que tenemos que abordar entre todas, buscando, bueno, espacios y redes entre nosotras, que para algunas empiezan a ser los espacios principales de articulación, y para otras son, como decimos a veces, espacios refugio, ¿no? Donde poder recargar fuerzas para volver luego a otros espacios no tan agradables, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, creo que poco a poco estamos aprendiendo a articularnos entre nosotras y a construir articulaciones también de otra forma, ¿no? Y redes en las que nos miremos a los ojos y pongamos el cuidado en el centro y no las siglas, ¿no? O sea, que es algo mucho más tradicional, ¿no? Aquí en pandemia hemos aprendido, bueno, las mujeres nos hemos articulado y hemos conseguido generar campañas bastante potentes, y creemos que una de las claves ha sido que nos hemos dejado las siglas en casa y que las campañas no las firmaba nadie y las firmábamos todas, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, creo que eso también es uno de los retos a tener en cuenta. Y bueno, creo que otro gran desafío es que la perspectiva feminista se priorice también, ¿no? Y que no hablemos de dos cosas separadas, sino que, como estáis diciendo, todo es una parte de la lucha contra una desigualdad y una opresión hegemónica, y tenemos que articular entre nosotras, ¿no? Y yo creo que eso todavía hoy estamos lejos de conseguirlo, incluso dentro de los propios espacios agroecológicos, ¿no? Esto que tenemos aquí hoy es una maravilla, pero luego tenemos que volver a nuestras realidades, y sabemos que esto, o sea, bueno, pues que nos toca recibir mucha leña por cuestionar estas cosas y por decir, bueno, pues muchas de las cosas que vamos a decir hoy aquí, ¿no? Creo que, o sea, la agroecología tiene como reto el legitimarse como modelo, aunque lleva siglos alimentando al mundo, y las mujeres tienen como reto legitimarse dentro de la propia agroecología, empezando por ahí, ¿no? Y no solo, o sea, y esto va también de ver digamos, de que tenemos que definir la viabilidad del sistema alimentario desde otro prisma, no desde la viabilidad de los proyectos, sino desde una viabilidad vital, ¿no? De cómo se sostienen realmente el sistema alimentario. Y eso implica también mirar, creo que hay un desafío a veces cuando hablamos de agroecología y feminismo, que es no mirar solo la parte agrícola, ¿no? Sino que las mujeres, digamos que en los diferentes eslabones del sistema alimentario somos desiguales, desde la mujer productora que no puede acceder a la tierra hasta la mujer consumidora que se mata de hambre y tiene anorexia porque tiene que responder a un sistema que le marca unas pautas, hasta la mujer que está haciendo cola para los bancos de alimentos, ¿no? Para poder alimentar a su familia. O sea, al final todas somos parte de un sistema desigual, y creo que hay que mirarlo en su amplitud, ¿no? Y por acabar, y así ya pasamos a que esto sea un poco más dinámico, perdonadme si me alargo demasiado, pero es que hay muchos retos. Creo que tenemos como reto, y nosotras lo abordamos un poco en el artículo que hemos escrito, ¿no? El tema de la escala y demás, tenemos como reto el definir qué criterios realmente utilizamos para decir cuándo un escalamiento agroecológico es exitoso o no, ¿no? Y mirarlo más allá de lo cuantitativo, porque a veces confundimos que haya mujeres con que haya un enfoque feminista, ¿no? Y la experiencia, bueno, nosotras lo compartimos un poco en el artículo, nos enseña que no por haber más cambia nada, o sea, porque no es lo mismo asistir que participar, y creo que eso es algo que tenemos que replantearnos muy seriamente, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, y luego, por último, creo que el gran desafío es que realmente cuando se diga feminismo se esté hablando de feminismo y no se esté hablando de otras cosas, ¿no? Y ya está, por aquí lo dejaría, perdonadme.
Thank you very much, Isa. So we were totally imagining that Iridiani would answer this question, but instead she has asked this question to Isa, which is fine. So, but then now I will introduce Isa, which I had not done yet. Isa is the Vice President and Advocacy Officer for URGENCI, which is the International CSA Network for Community-Supported Agriculture. She's based in the Basque Country, and she's also an active member of the Civil Society Mechanism, which is a space that she shares with Iridiani. Now, Iridiani, then we come to you. Maybe you could also share with us, you write about a case of social mobilization with peasant women in Brazil, which has been very successful in spreading agroecology and strengthening the women's movement, and also in developing public policies for agroecology. From your experience, both in your territory and in international spaces, what do you see as the opportunities as well as the threats for the scaling or the amplification of agroecology, of a feminist agroecology?
Bien, primero decir que también comparto con los desafíos y retos y oportunidades que ha puesto Isabel. Y nosotras, particularmente desde nuestra experiencia y nuestro acúmulo, creo que de muchos años de lucha y de construcción de la agroecología, de los movimientos campesinos, sociales, de consumidores, en fin, se ha construido una gran red de articulación a nivel nacional, regional, internacional. Creo que eso es un gran avance, una gran oportunidad que tenemos, incluso eso, estarmos aquí hoy es resultado de eso, de esta gran red de lucha y de organización por la agroecología, y poder haber llevado la agroecología también a espacios importantes de discusión de políticas públicas, como los espacios de la FAO, la misma mecanismo de la sociedad civil, que ha podido y ha logrado que se pusiera en el debate del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria la discusión de la agroecología como una de las alternativas y una de las posibilidades para nosotras, la única, ¿no? La única salida para poder garantizar la seguridad, la soberanía alimentaria y también poder enfrentar toda essa situação também climática que estamos vivendo no mundo, que hoje é tão grave, e aqui no Brasil não hace falta dizer quão grave estamos passando por essa situação, pero também esses avanços são fundamentais, e hemos tenido também experiências exitosas na construção de políticas públicas nesse marco. No caso brasileiro especialmente, hemos construído uma política nacional de agroecologia, la PNAPO e o PLANAPO, que é o Plan Nacional de Agroecologia, com a participação de las organizaciones sociales y sobre todo con gran participación e impulso desde las mujeres de organizaciones sociales, y nuestra experiencia, la que presentamos en el mismo artículo, ella es fruto de la organización política de las mujeres, pero ella fue fundamentalmente potencializada por la construcción y la existencia de políticas públicas que hemos construido en el caso a nivel de Estado, a nivel de Brasil. Si no fueran las políticas de las cisternas, que son políticas de captación de agua, porque nuestra experiencia es específicamente una región semiárida, de bastante diferentes desequilibrios en el caso de las lluvias, si no fueran las políticas de los mercados institucionales para compra de los alimentos producidos por los campesinos y principalmente también la lucha que los movimientos y las mujeres hemos dado para que en estas políticas existieran garantías de que las mujeres tuviéramos un porcentaje, un percentual de participación, porque ni solo porque es agroecología significa que nosotras estábamos visibilizadas en ese espacio, entonces fue necesaria una lucha, una organización colectiva de las mujeres para garantizar un percentual de participación de las mujeres en los contratos de compra y de venta de los productos de las asociaciones, también las políticas de asistencia técnica con enfoque agroecológico y también con enfoque de capacitaciones específicas para grupos de mujeres, para garantizar toda una línea de reconocimiento del trabajo y de la organización de las mujeres. Sin embargo, todas esas potencialidades también sufren en ese momento grandes ataques, que son la desconstrucción de estas políticas, la invisibilidad de esas políticas. Y entonces eso también es un reto enorme de hacer la discusión para que esas políticas vuelvan a ganar su espacio y que son fundamentales para el desarrollo del campo brasileño, especialmente.
Thank you very much. My colleagues are now collecting questions in the chat. So if anyone has a question to Iridiani, to Leonida, to Isabel, or to Rachel, you can put your questions in the chat. Meanwhile, I will now start asking the first question that they have collected, which is for Leonida. So we now have a panel of 4 speakers, 4 women who will be answering your questions. Leonida, are you there? Your question is, we have all identified land access as a key issue for women at the rural level, a key problem. Now, it could help to unlock the transition to feminist agroecology. If we address this, how do you, in your experience, how do you think it can be best addressed? How can we ensure access and control over land for women?
Okay, one way through which this can be addressed, because what's happening is that, for example, when women get widowed, the first thing that happens is that they get dispossessed of the land. What needs to happen is that women should push for joint titling, so that their names appear on the title deed as opposed to only the husband's name appearing on the title deed. Another thing is that in many constitutions, for example, the Kenyan constitutions recognizes the ownership of land by women. So you can also push it through the constitutional provision. And lastly, the other thing that maybe women could do is start pushing for having, for being part of the title deed process, because you find that in many land boards, most land boards are male dominated. So having women, for example, part of the land boards, when disputes related to land are being settled and there are women in those land boards, the decisions may be in favor of women as opposed to an all-man land board. Maybe that's what how I can respond to that. And of course, women also need to, even from a tender age, even before they become widowed, we ought to encourage women to own property, because many women presume that property is for men, so they don't even look at themselves as people who ought to own property. So when women start looking at property as something that they should own, then when there's any form of contestation, they can even to an extent even self-represent themselves in court when they have an issue of land. So we also need to create awareness and a change of attitude towards looking at land, especially from a female perspective. Thank you. I hope I've responded.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, this is such a crucial issue. Is there anyone else from the speakers who would like to say something about this? we can also move on to the next question, which is for Rachel. Rachel, somebody's wondering if you can explain better the difference between gender equality and gender equity. And could you expand on this question with respect to feminist agroecology? So specifically for feminist agroecology, what is the difference?
So equity is different from equality. If you think about, you have the analogy that's often used in general is if you have two people standing, one is shorter than the other, and one person can't see over a fence because they're shorter than the other, but they're equal. They have equal access to the seeing over the fence, but one of them needs to have to see over the fence. Maybe it's not a great metaphor, but equity recognizes historical, social factors, political factors, which means that some people have less access to things like land or education, or there are norms, which means there is accepted violence towards certain groups of people. So that's one kind of fundamental starting place. One way to look at it would be if you're having an agroecology training and you're addressing it just thinking about equality, you might want to make sure you have equal numbers of men and women present at the event. But it may be when you do that training that women don't say anything, because in that culture, it's not really acceptable for women to take a leadership role or to ask questions. And that means they may not be learning as much because they don't have opportunity to talk. Having a feminist equity attention would mean finding ways to address concerns about women speaking in public, and maybe changing the very way that you do the training, and incorporating discussions about gender into the training. Another example that we've had in our own work in Malawi is we've had very active women take on leadership roles and do farmer-to-farmer training in different villages, only to have their husbands say, hold on a minute, this is really encouraging my wife to be an adulterer, because it's not common for women to travel long distances and to go to other villages and do teaching like that. So we've had to have serious conversations with men about the role that their wife is taking, and that isn't always easy. Sometimes that's a very bumpy dialogue, but that's one way that we've tried to address it in a sort of feminist way, by addressing structural issues such as women's mobility, women's access to education, women's access to leadership, that goes beyond just making sure you have equal numbers of men and women present at an event, but really paying attention to the dynamics that make it harder for women to access those. Those are two examples.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you. Iridiani, the next question is for you. And I will ask you in Spanish because it was asked in Spanish. ¿Qué hace que una práctica agroecológica es diferente que otra práctica? ¿Qué hace que una práctica agroecológica, a diferencia de otra, sea feminista? ¿Qué hace que una práctica agroecológica, a diferencia de otra, sea feminista? Twice. So, what makes an agroecological practice feminist when another agroecological practice maybe is not feminist? How can we define that? How can we identify a feminist agroecological practice? Could you respond to this?
Sí. Bueno, en primer lugar, esa es una discusión bastante amplia y está en el centro de nuestra proposición y de pensar, un pensar feminista sobre todas las cosas, sobre todo, ¿no? Sobre transformar lo más profundo de las relaciones. Y en la agroecología no es distinto, porque podemos pensar y entendemos la agroecología como una forma de vivir, de ser de producir, de relacionar, de relaciones de trabajo, de equidad, de derechos, de derecho a la tierra, como la pregunta que se ha hecho anteriormente, que es un tema central en la agroecología. No es posible haber agroecología sin el derecho al acceso a la tierra y a los territorios de los pueblos, de los campesinos, de las personas que viven en el campo y que trabajan. No es posible haber agroecología sin reforma agraria, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y entonces, para nosotras, de la misma forma, no es posible pensar la agroecología en donde, por ejemplo, las relaciones de trabajo, las relaciones de poder sean jerárquicas y sean distintas para hombres y mujeres. ¿Cómo pensar, por ejemplo, la producción de alimentos? Y es un tema central, por ejemplo, que nosotros tratamos en nuestra experiencia de visibilizar, y es uno de los ejes centrales de la perspectiva feminista en la agroecología, de pensar cómo visibilizar, cómo reconocer, cómo valorar el trabajo que nosotras las mujeres del campo siempre hemos hecho en la producción de alimentos. Sí, por un lado, la lucha feminista es por la lucha del derecho a las mujeres al trabajo, pero nosotras mujeres del campo y también mujeres negras, pensando mucho en el contexto latinoamericano, sobre todo, como nosotras siempre trabajamos, pero nuestro trabajo nunca fue reconocido, siempre fue negado. Nosotras no somos vistas como trabajadoras, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo ver eso, valorar también todo el acúmulo que tenemos en la producción de conocimientos fundamentales para el desarrollo de la agricultura, pero no cualquier agricultura. La agricultura que nosotros hablamos es la agricultura campesina, agroecológica, y la agroecología necesita tener toda esa mirada de una transformación de paradigma de forma integral, donde también están el tema productivo, pero está el tema ambiental, el tema social, el tema económico, el tema de no violencia hacia las mujeres. Sabemos que existe y es en todo el mundo, los datos también de violencia hacia las mujeres son enormes en el campo y en la ciudad, pero en el campo también son altísimos, y en la pandemia, por lo menos en el contexto brasileño, eso se quedó más fuerte aún, el tema de la violencia se afloró aún más por el tema del aislamiento social, las distancias. Entonces, ¿cómo superar eso? Nosotros entendemos que la agroecología no es agroecología, puede ser otra cosa, pero agroecología como nosotros la defendemos tiene que tener esta mirada de transformaciones realmente profundas de las relaciones humanas, de las relaciones de trabajo, de las relaciones entre los géneros. No es posible también pensar en agroecología cuando pensamos en grandes dimensiones, por ejemplo, de que una única persona detiene grandes cantidades de tierra y tiene trabajadores y trabajadoras que son explotados en ese espacio, aunque la producción sea, por ejemplo, sin usar venenos, sin usar transgénicos, etcétera, puede ser una producción orgánica, pero no es agroecológica, porque ahí existen relaciones de explotación, existen algunos que tienen que trabajar para que otros puedan acumular lucros en beneficio, en detrimento del trabajo de otros. Y el feminismo es ese aporte que nosotras pensamos y sentimos que es fundamental y necesario para transformar, para construir y valorar el trabajo, el reconocimiento del trabajo, el reconocimiento del saber de las mujeres y para generar autonomías. Si nosotras como feministas queremos la autonomía de las mujeres, que nuestra capacidad de decidir, de participar políticamente, socialmente, económicamente, la agroecología es también esa autonomía sobre los territorios, sobre la autonomía de cómo producir, de qué forma producir, comercializar. Entonces la agroecología y el feminismo se unen en esa construcción de construir autonomías de los territorios, pero también de la vida de los campesinos, de las mujeres y de nuestros cuerpos, que es algo fundamental en esa lucha.
Thank you so much, Iridiani. What a fantastic answer. When I hear Iridiani speak, I always think like she's reading from a book, she's prepared it, but she just does it like that. She improvises a really thoughtful and complete answer. Thank you so much, Iridiani. Isa, the last question is for you. What are your thoughts regarding influencing policy. Can you share more on how to influence policy on agroecology, especially in a situation when national governments are very focused on external fertilizers? And then the issue of feminism. How can feminism help to do this? How can feminism interlink with the agroecology discourse that we often hear at the policy level?
Bueno, me habéis dejado la fácil para el final, ¿eh?
Exacto.
A ver, bueno, yo creo que bueno, la influencia viene de la lucha, eso creo que todas las que estamos aquí lo tenemos clave, ¿no? Y creo que, bueno, nunca ha sido fácil, pero es que ahora es súper difícil. Ya incluso espacios que se entendían como medio accesibles, cada vez lo son menos. Las que participamos aquí en el Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria estamos viendo locuras todos los días. Esta situación de pandemia además ha hecho que todo se vuelva virtual, lo que para la gente que no somos funcionariado de estas cosas hace muy difícil también la participación, el acceso, ¿no? El no poder vernos también y la articulación, porque bueno, yo personalmente tengo un acceso a internet más o menos, pero no todo el mundo tiene acceso para seguir reuniones ni siquiera para seguir este webinar, ¿no? Yo creo que el gran desafío con las políticas públicas es intentar humanizar algo que es absolutamente patriarcal, jerárquico y que es todo lo contrario de lo que ha estado explicando perfectamente Iridiani, ¿no? O sea, que está en las antípodas de eso. Y creo que, que sí que es un gran reto. Aún así, bueno, hay puntos de entrada, yo creo, pero tenemos que tener claro nuestra lente cuando entramos también, ¿no? Creo que, por ejemplo, ahora una narrativa que se está abriendo con sus pros y sus contras es el tema de la agricultura familiar, por ejemplo, ¿no? Es un tema que está ahora encima de la mesa, que muchos gobiernos vocalizan, tenemos una década, bueno, tenemos un montón de cosas. Bueno, hay personas, bueno, hay muchas campesinas que lo ven como un punto de entrada, de defensa de un modelo, y yo creo que puede serlo, pero también puede no serlo, ¿no? Y creo que también la agricultura familiar es una parte de la agroecología, pero hay más allá de la agricultura familiar. Y creo que si queremos aprovechar ese punto de entrada, también nos tiene que servir para repensar de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de familia, de qué hablamos o miremos las relaciones que hay dentro de las propias familias, ¿no? Que es una institución muy patriarcal también, ¿no? Y esto también lo sabemos y hay que decirlo. Entonces, bueno, hay puntos de entrada, pero hay que ver cómo jugamos ahí dentro. El cambio climático es una evidencia y ahora también hay otra cuestión, que es el tema de la sostenibilidad, que también les gusta nombrar mucho, y que podemos aprovechar para colarnos ahí, digamos, ¿no? La cuestión es que no sustituyamos derechos por sostenibilidad, que es un poco a lo que nos están llevando en muchos lugares, ¿no? Que estamos borrando la palabra derechos para sustituirla por sostenibilidad y que lo cubra todo, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que eso, que hay puntos de entrada, pero bueno, ¿y cómo apoya el feminismo? ¿Cómo se interrelaciona ahí la perspectiva feminista? Bueno, yo creo que todo lo que se ha dicho lo suscribo perfectamente. Yo diría también ahí que desde un punto de vista incluso narrativo, cuando hablamos de feminismo, hablamos del famoso iceberg, ¿no? De lo visible, lo invisible, de toda la parte productiva, la reproductiva, y distinguimos, ¿no? En la narrativa feminista entre trabajo y empleo, ¿no? O sea que hay trabajo, hay muchos trabajos y luego hay algunos que están considerados empleos y otros no. Pues en el sistema alimentario y a la hora de hablar de políticas públicas también, algo que estamos usando mucho últimamente es diferenciar entre producto comestible y alimento, ¿no? O sea, porque una cosa es lo que es productivo y lo que puede parecerse a algo que se puede comer y que de hecho muchas lo dan por comestible, y otra cosa es lo que nos alimenta realmente, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que son cuestiones que se retroalimentan entre sí, porque al final sí que hemos entendido en la agroecología que hay que repensar, hay que cuidar la tierra, que tenemos que repensar qué es el mercado, que tenemos que repensar qué es la participación política, y nos falta o sea, meter y que se entienda lo más importante, que es lo que lo sostiene todo, que es los cuidados y la reproducción de la vida, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que ahí el feminismo tiene que alimentar eso y yo creo también que cuando hablamos de una cuestión importante en las políticas públicas es que hablamos siempre de derechos y de la indivisibilidad de los derechos, ¿no? Y la indivisibilidad de los derechos, que la tenemos todo el día en la boca, se tiene que traducir en la indivisibilidad de las luchas, ¿no? Y en que realmente seamos interseccionales y que nos alimentemos entre nosotras, ¿no? Entonces creo que ahí es donde para mí confluye un poco todo.
Thank you, Isa. These are very wise words. Thank you so much. For you and also for the other speakers, there have been a lot of comments in the chats that people appreciate your answers, that they give them food for thought, and that they would like to hear more. So we will send everyone a message probably tomorrow with a link to the magazine, as well as the contact details of the speakers, so that you can get in touch with them if you have any other questions. Because we are nearing the end of this webinar, it's already been almost an hour and a half. So now I would like to turn to our last speaker for a final reflection. Some closing remarks. We will invite from Emma Siliprandi. Emma is an agriculture officer at the FAO. Many of us know her because she's part of the agroecology team. And she has done a tremendous job within the FAO to advance agroecology in the institution. Emma also teaches courses in the University of Cordoba in Spain, and she has previously done studies on feminism, ecofeminism, gender, food sovereignty, and public policy. So she is perfectly placed to give us a reflection on what she has heard today. Emma, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Would you be able to reflect on these voices from the ground that you have heard this afternoon in our region? It's the afternoon, and how also let us know how they link to the processes that you are a part of within the FAO, but also the Committee on World Food Security and maybe even the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit.
Okay. Voy a hablar en español porque también es más fácil para mí para conectar todas estas ideas. Entonces, quería agradecer a la invitación para participar de este evento. Me parece que este número de la revista es más que oportuno, yo diría que es necesario en este momento. ¿Y por qué digo eso? Porque es justamente porque se tratan de artículos de opinión, de experiencias, de entrevistas en diferentes partes del mundo que nos muestran cómo las mujeres están construyendo la agroecología. Y no solo nos muestran eso, sino que también nos muestran sus reflexiones sobre estos desafíos y sobre estas oportunidades que estuvimos hablando ahora, escuchando a nuestras colegas con tanta fuerza, tanto impacto de las experiencias que viven en el campo. Entonces yo creo que esta revista es muy importante por eso. Y sobre todo porque está planteando este tema del feminismo, que como otras colegas ya comentaron, es un tema que va mucho más allá del reconocimiento de las desigualdades de género. El feminismo trata de ver a las mujeres como protagonistas del cambio y como pensadoras que tienen sus propias ideas sobre cómo hacer el cambio, no solo de la situación de las mujeres, sino que de toda la sociedad. Entonces, estas discusiones, todos los artículos de la revista y lo que hemos visto hoy nos muestran que las mujeres están actuando sobre esta realidad y están pensando sobre ellas y están articulándose para cambiar esta situación. Y todo, eso es lo que yo creo que es lo más interesante en este momento. Porque el feminismo es un enfoque necesario. Es un enfoque necesario justamente porque nos plantea un cambio de valores en que se ponen las mujeres como sujetos políticos plenos, con sus experiencias, sus propuestas, y introduce un cambio en la forma de la sociedad que queremos, que es una sociedad sin estas desigualdades todas. Y yo aprovecho para incorporar lo que Rachel nos trajo sobre el tema de la interseccionalidad, porque yo creo que esto viene junto con el feminismo. No es solo la cuestión de la desigualdad entre los géneros, es también todas las desigualdades de clase, de raza, de castas, etc. Bueno, estamos todos hablando que estamos en una crisis agroalimentaria, la crisis del COVID, etc. Y que la agroecología es una propuesta transformadora. Porque vemos que la agroecología puede integrar de una forma exitosa, ¿no?, los temas de biodiversidad, de la degradación de la tierra, del agua, de los ecosistemas, pero también es una propuesta que quiere cambiar esta relación de la humanidad con la naturaleza y de la humanidad consigo misma, ¿no?, entre las personas. Y yo creo que eso es fundamental, y ahí pues la cuestión del feminismo entra justamente para radicalizar esta visión que tenemos de agroecología, que no es meramente un cambio tecnológico, no es un cambio de prácticas agrícolas, es un cambio de valores, de poner la vida en el centro y de reorganizar toda la sociedad. Muchas de ustedes ya hablaron de estos espacios internacionales, como por ejemplo es el Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria Mundial, donde Iridiani, ISA participan como representantes de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil. También hablamos del panel de altos expertos, donde Rachel fue parte del panel que escribió el informe sobre agroecología y otros enfoques innovadores para la agricultura sostenible. Yo creo que estos son espacios muy importantes donde se está discutiendo, digamos, en alto nivel, orientaciones para los gobiernos, lugares donde se marca un discurso sobre lo que se presentan como alternativas para cambiar esta crisis que estamos viviendo y para cambiar el sistema agroalimentario en general, ¿no? Yo veo con mucha atención y que en estos varios espacios se está también introduciendo casi siempre por presión de la sociedad civil, por presión de los movimientos de mujeres, también estos temas relacionados con género, con igualdad de género, con mayor participación de las mujeres, con una mirada diferente, etc. Por ejemplo, las guías voluntarias sobre sistemas alimentarios y nutrición, que será discutida en la reunión del CFS la próxima semana, del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria Mundial, que llamamos CFS en inglés, y también las recomendaciones de políticas derivadas del informe presentado por el panel de expertos de alto nivel sobre agroecología. Esto todo va a ser discutido la próxima semana. Y en estos dos documentos, por ejemplo, se habla de la necesidad de actuar para cambiar efectivamente la situación de las mujeres, en especial de las mujeres rurales, para la garantía de acceso a recursos económicos, físicos, técnicos, mejorando su poder de actuación política, su voz, su estatus social, de forma a cambiar las leyes, reglamentos, etc. Y es importante que en estos momentos también lancemos mano de documentos que ya han sido aprobados internacionalmente, como es el caso de la CEDAW, y la Convención ahora no me acuerdo exactamente lo que quiere decir, pero es para acabar con todas las discriminaciones de las mujeres en las leyes. Los objetivos de desarrollo sostenibles, especialmente el objetivo número 5, que habla de igualdad de género, y otras convenciones internacionales como por ejemplo los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, los campesinos, la década de agricultura familiar que Isa acaba de comentar. O sea, estos son, digamos, espacios internacionales donde ya se aprobó medidas que significan cambiar la situación de las mujeres. La cuestión es cómo implementar esto en la práctica, cómo hacer presión sobre los gobiernos y también sobre las instituciones internacionales para que eso sea realidad, para que se implementen políticas, programas, etcétera, que ataquen las causas de las iniquidades y que acabe con la violencia contra las mujeres. Entonces, esos son algunos puntos que quería comentar. Por otro lado, hay también una otra cuestión que incluso en el chat se estaba hablando un poco de eso. Cada vez más nos piden o nos plantean esta cuestión de que las políticas tienen que ser basadas en evidencias. Muchas veces esto es apenas una disculpa para mantenerse la situación como está, para decir que no hay datos científicos, no hay análisis, etc. Pero es muy importante tener estos datos, es muy importante tener metodologías que muestren lo que está ocurriendo. Y por eso también yo creo que esta publicación que está siendo lanzada ahora es muy importante porque nos da muchas pistas para discutir eso, cómo es que las mujeres están implicadas como productoras rurales, como gerentes de los recursos naturales, como organizadoras de sus comunidades desde los territorios, están involucradas en la construcción de experiencias innovadoras del punto de vista técnico, económico, social, político, cultural. O sea, es esto que nos están pidiendo, estas evidencias, y ustedes están publicando eso con las palabras de las propias mujeres, y eso yo creo que cobra mucha importancia. Eso viene a, digamos, sumarse también a una serie de esfuerzos que se hacen a nivel mundial para crear metodologías que buscan caracterizar y medir la performance de la agroecología. Yo quería citar, por ejemplo, las cadernetas agroecológicas creadas por el Centro de Tecnologías Alternativas de la Zona da Mata en Brasil y ahora está siendo difundidas por instituciones internacionales como el FIDA, el método LUME, que Paulo es uno de los coordinadores de análisis económico-ecológica de las propiedades, la herramienta TAPE, desarrollada por la FAO, que es una herramienta para la evaluación de la performance de la agroecología, que se creó en el marco de la iniciativa de ampliación de la escala de la agroecología. Todo esto son intentos que hacemos de dar más visibilidad al trabajo de las mujeres en la agroecología, pero no solo en términos productivos estricto sensu, sino también de un punto de vista multidimensional, de la reproducción de las familias, de la reproducción social. Pues esto significa un paso adelante en el campo de la investigación social, pues nos permitirá consolidar una visión sobre la contribución de las mujeres a la agroecología, no solo del punto de vista económico. Entonces,
Emma, I'm going to have to stop you. It's already 5 o'clock and people are leaving.
Okay. No,
maybe a final word. Go ahead.
Yes, simplemente para decir que es una conjunción de esfuerzos para mostrar, para dar visibilidad a las mujeres y su contribución a la agroecología. Entonces, yo creo que estamos todos en la misma página. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you very much also for emphasizing again the importance and the value of experiences and on-the-ground practices and how much we can learn from that. This is exactly what we try to do with the magazine, to capture that knowledge and to be able to distribute that knowledge. I would like to thank all of our speakers, Leonida, Rachel, Iridiani, Isa, and Emma, for their fantastic contributions, their thoughts, and their time today with us. It's been hugely appreciated also by the people in the chat. It's been really wonderful to be with all of you today. Now, before we go to Francois, who is going to officially launch the magazine and finally give you the URL where you can find it. I'd like to invite Sophia for half a minute to show us her drawing, which we will also share with you online and in an email. But let's see what she has made while our speakers were presenting. That's beautiful. Women are the protagonists of change.
Here we go. Yes, here we go.
Yes.
Hi. Oh, what a rich discussion. I'm so pleased, because the fact that you see many drawings means that it was a very visually pleasing, at least to me. There were so many fantastic points. Also, as a woman who is not really familiar with this subject, it was very nice to hear so many initiatives. I had a great time intellectually as well. So thanks for having me. One thing that I personally like, the one detail, if you don't mind me sharing, was when we were talking about the joint ownership of land. I really like that piece of illustration. I think that is my favorite. So
thank you so much, Sophia. This is beautiful. And I think we need a bit more time to look at everything you've drawn and written and how it all relates to each other. But it's wonderful to see your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Then, now we turn to François Delvaux, who works with SITSE in the Brussels office. And it's time for François to formally launch the magazine, Farming Matters.
Yes. So, yeah, I want also to share my screen so that everybody can have a sneak preview at the cover and the back cover of the magazine that we've produced together with the Agricultures Network and Cultivate. So yeah, on behalf of all the editorial board and those organizations, first, thanks for participating to this really dynamic and really interesting webinar. Somehow it was a sort of appetizer because there's more food for thoughts in the magazine itself, and hopefully that will be the basis for other conversation, and we'll be able to bring forward such important thematic in other space and discussion. So basically, if you go on any of our website from the organization that are behind this organization, then you will find now the magazine in a PDF version. So far it's only in English, but later this year, in November, we will have also the magazine translated into Portuguese and in Spanish. And there will be also a specific launch event in those languages that we'll organize at later stage, but we will come back to you with more information at that time. So just thanks again. Please do connect to one of those websites and just, well, hopefully you'll enjoy the magazine as much as you seem to have enjoyed this webinar.
Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.